This is Tom Compton with We Hold These Truths, and welcome to We Hold These Truths Speaks Out. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have with us our California Outreach Director, Craig Hanson, and the founder of We Hold These Truths, Chuck Carlson. And our topic is attack on liberty leads to perpetual war. And I think it should be obvious to most Americans, but I don't think it is. The United States has a war-based economy. I think it's lost. We know that's true with the evangelical Christians who we've been challenging for over 20 years. And we'll talk about some of these issues, but I'm going to turn this over to Craig to have us learn what does he mean by attack on liberty leads to perpetual war. Craig?
Well, thanks, Tom and Chuck. It's always good to be with you. Tonight on We Hold These Truths Speaks Out, I'm going to be talking about an act of war committed against the United States of America in 1967 and the cover-up of that act of war that still exists to this day, and how that cover-up has driven the United States into a perpetual war-based economy, just like you were mentioning there, Tom. And to show how successful that cover-up has been, I'd like you to ask 10 of your friends if they know about the attack on the USS Liberty by the Israeli military on June 8th, 1967, in the middle of the Six-Day War. Well, maybe because you're watching this podcast and you and your friends are more savvy than the rest of the population. But when I try it, I find that probably 7 to 8 out of 10 people know nothing about the USS Liberty. And then, but maybe 1 or 2 have heard of it, but they believe the story that the attack was an accidental attack by the Israelis, kind of a case of mistaken identity or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But about 1 out of 10 that has really done their research and they've examined the evidence realize that this indeed was an act of war against the United States of America. Okay, so there's the problem. Now let's look at some of the facts. And before I get going, I'd like to say there's so much information about the attack on the USS Liberty out on the internet. And if you really want to know, I mean, it's out there. I've even got my, let's see if I can make this work. I've got my shirt. there we go. USS Liberty shirt on. I got that from the survivors, USS Liberty Veterans Survivors Association. Anyway, why I got prompted to do this podcast tonight on the USS Liberty, it's kind of twofold. First, a True News organization has just completed a 4-hour documentary on the USS Liberty attack, and it's told by the survivors themselves. Of the different ones, Al Jazeera did one, BBC has done one. You go on the internet and go on YouTube and look for USS Liberty videos, and there's a lot of information out there, but this is the only one, and it's current, that it's being done with interviews with the survivors themselves. So it makes it quite a bit different, and it really is an historical event because like the rest of us here, the survivors are getting older and older. And one of the gentlemen who was actually in the documentary died after filming, but before it was released. So it's kind of like when you go to the World War II veterans, you start losing them. So these guys are still around, still telling their story, and it's really, to me, it's a historical a document that is now available. And okay, so that was the kind of the first impetus on why to do this tonight. And the second one being on President Trump's nomination acceptance speech, when he praises and honors our military veterans. And you'll see how they connect as we get along here. So the government USS Liberty official line kind of goes like this. The USS Liberty was a converted old World War II Victory cargo ship that had been converted into a spy ship with the latest and greatest electronics that were available in 1968. It was sent to the Eastern Mediterranean and international waters to monitor the hostilities between Israel and the Arab nations. It arrived off the coast of Egypt, off the Sinai, on June 7th. On the afternoon of June 8th, the USS Liberty was mistaken for an Egyptian ship, and the Israeli military attacked her. After only 2 hours of attacking the Liberty, did the Israelis realize their grave mistake and called off the attack. The Israeli government notified Washington, D.C. and apologized for their error. Case closed. That's the line. You go into different documents, and that's what you find. I was looking, I think it was like Encyclopedia Britannica or something online, and that's the information that you can get. Well, if that were true, and it was simply a case of friendly fire or mistaken identity, we wouldn't be having this conversation this evening. And I'm sorry to say that the truth is much more sinister. It's a much more sinister narrative than I just gave you on the official line. And I'll hit some of the highlights here of the facts that have come out a lot since the attack back in 67. So then we'll open up for discussion and kick some of these things around. Well, okay, some of the basic facts. There were 294 men on board, and over 150 they were Naval Security Group personnel, kind of NSA, basically the spooks. You know, they were on board. And if you've seen pictures of the ship, it's got all these antennas and all this stuff. I mean, basically, it was like Fort Huachuca. Anything that's out there electronically, it could suck in and go through it. They had interpreters. They had Russian interpreters, Hebrew interpreters, Arabic interpreters. They had a whole panoply of people out there that could basically decipher and decode anything that was being picked up on an electronic basis. Well, of those 294 men on board, 34 were killed and 171 were wounded. Okay, so that's the facts. And this is where it starts getting ugly. The U.S. knew that the hostilities were likely to occur between Israel and the Arab nations, and so they sent the Sixth Fleet out into the Mediterranean. And so they were there, knowing that something was getting ready to happen, and then Israel preemptively attacked Egypt at 7:45 in the morning on June 5th. So that was the first rounds being fired. And I'd just like to put right in here, there was some confusion. Egypt was saying Israel attacked. Israel was saying, well, no, Egypt attacked first, and so forth and so on. But as we understand more of the Mossad and their out of the Talmud, it says, if your enemy seeks to kill you, rise up and kill him first. So that is a basic philosophical, spiritual understanding that is embedded deep into the whole Israeli mindset. But anyway, so Israel's fired up and fired on Egypt on that morning of June 5th. And at that point, the U.S. Liberty had been off the western coast of Africa. Excuse me, not at that point, but earlier, the Liberty had been off the western coast of Africa. And then when she got the orders to head to the Sinai Peninsula, so it was motoring full steam from Africa around into the Med and down heading towards the Sinai. And so it was the night of the 7th when the USS Liberty finally got into position there. So on the morning of June 8th, that's where everything started going bad. Israeli reconnaissance planes overflew the Liberty 13 times, and it was interesting. It was a beautiful sunny day. Guys were out on the deck sunbathing, and this reconnaissance plane flew over, just kept flying over with the Star of David on, and so they were waving at the pilot. They thought, okay, we're okay. They know we're here. They're friendly. They're part of our allies. This is good. They're flying the big stars and stripes up, and it's got big GTR 5 10-inch lettering across the bow, and it says Liberty. I mean, it's pretty obvious with all the antennas sticking up. So the notion that this was being confused for an Egyptian cargo ship, it really doesn't hold any water at all. No cargo ship would look like that. But anyway, I digress. Also in the Med at the time was another American spy ship. It was called USNS, and it's called the Private Jose F. Valdez. Was another spy ship that was in the Med, but it was heading out. It was heading back to the States. So that was a fact. Also, another fact: the U.S. government relations with Egypt, President Abdel Nasser, they were very strained. There was just some tension there, and I don't have all the details on that, but wasn't relations between U.S. and Egypt weren't very good at that time. Okay, so about 2 o'clock, sometime that afternoon, Israeli Air Force attacked the USS Liberty with unmarked French Mirage jets, and they just started assaulting and just blowing the ship full of holes. And again, if you go onto YouTube, watch any of this, there's pictures of the Liberty, just the bullet holes. So many men were injured and killed by the shrapnel just from all this stuff being shot at them. And again, they were unmarked French Mirage jets that the Israelis had. And I guess there was another kind of jet too, but they're both unmarked. And so when the attack first came, the call went out that Liberty was being attacked by unknown aircraft, unknown who it was, because Israelis had just been there in the morning. They knew that was who they were, but these were unmarked jets, fighter jets coming at them. Then the worst part of it came later, about I think 2 hours into the attack. The Israelis sent motor torpedo boats were brought in to the attack to finish the job. And at that point, they fired 5 torpedoes, but of the 5, 4 missed, but 1 didn't. And that's the one that went below the waterline, as any torpedo does, below the waterline. And it went into that compartment where the NSA people, the guys were. And in that one hit, 24 sailor NSA civilian U.S. personnel, they were killed in that one blast when that torpedo went in. And then there's fire on deck. It was a big mess. The Israeli motor torpedo boats started shooting up the life rafts. The life rafts were lowered down and to try to get some of the crew off, and the gunboats were shooting up the life rafts. And then the Israeli jets were dropping napalm on the deck of the ship, and all the frequencies were being jammed. And so the antennas were all blown up. And so it was like the reconnaissance planes that circled around 13 times in the morning, took all the pictures. All those pictures got gone through their intelligence and so forth. What are the vulnerable spots and so forth and so on and so on. These are the places you need to hit. And they came back in spades and just really did their damage to the ship. So what they found, the guys at Liberty, that the only time the signal was not jammed was when the rockets were being sent, the missiles were being sent from the jets, because they didn't want to jam the communications with the guided missiles. So there was a brief moment of time that they'd unjam unjam the frequencies, and then they'd launch the rockets, and then they jam the frequencies again. In that period of time, one of the sailors was able to run a long coax up to one of the high antennas that had been blown apart, but just was able to run another piece of wire up there, and he got a mayday out that they were being attacked. And at that point, they knew who it was. The Star of David was on the motor torpedo boats. Okay, so anyway, let me back up a little bit. Jamming the frequencies, blowing up the life rafts, dropping napalm on the deck. All those things are war crimes in and of themselves, and also having unmarked planes. That's all. Those are all war crimes. Okay, so the Israeli attack was called off once the Mayday went out, because the Israelis reconnaissance, they heard that too, and the Sixth Fleet also heard that they were now being attacked, and the Sixth Fleet responded that they were going to have support there in 10 minutes. Well, that's what the guys in the Liberty heard. But what happened next is this is where it gets really ugly. Jets from the Sixth Fleet, which was aboard the USS America, which was a carrier, one of our aircraft carriers, was about 300 miles away, and the jets were recalled. Excuse me, they were launched, and then they recalled by Secretary Robert McNamara. He called the jets back. And then one of the commanders on the aircraft carrier says, "No, run it up a higher chain." Lyndon Johnson recalled him back and said he didn't want to embarrass an ally. How did he know? He didn't. How did he know who was shooting up the Liberty? At that point, it was still kind of who's shooting who here. So it's a really ugly spot on our government. And so what I see on this is the goal of the mission was a total false flag operation. It really was a conspiracy between the Israel and the United States to sink an American ship, blame it on the Egyptians, and use that as a pretext to draw us, the U.S., into the Israeli-Arab war on behalf of Israel. So what would be the payoff to the United States? Why would we want to do something like that? Well, first of all, got to remember who's in office. It's Lyndon Johnson. Vietnam was going on, and it was really an unpopular war, and he needed to rally more support for the military. And this would do it. Oh, we're under attack. We've got to join together. The kind of the war cry. And also, Lyndon Johnson needed help with his re-election campaign. At this point, he was still planning on running in '68. So he needed help, and also this would be a great boon for the military-industrial complex back home. And they hated Egypt anyway with Nasser, and they would get him out of the way. So that was the pro side for the payoff for the U.S. Well, what did Israel stand to lose in this bargain? Well, nothing. Even after, if it had been successful, Liberty would have gone to the bottom. Egypt would have been attacked by the United States. We would have been brought into another war. And there's some confusion whether there were nuclear weapons on the jets that were being launched from the USS America, or whether they switched them out, because they had been doing a nuclear drill where they'd switched them out and put conventionals on, or there's nuclears are coming. Anyway, Egypt was going to be attacked by our jets. So that was the plan. Well, it got foiled because that one sailor got the Mayday out, and Israel called off the attack. But so how did it affect Israel? Well, in May of 1968, the Israeli government paid the United States $3.3 million to the United States for compensation for the families of the 34 men that were killed. So $3.3 million. Then a year later, in March of '69, they paid a further $3.6 million to the men who had been wounded. Okay, I talked about them. Then 11 years later, in 1980, Israel agreed to pay $6 million as the final settlement for the material damage to the Liberty itself, plus 13 years of interest. Okay, but didn't I say it cost Israel nothing? Well, it cost them nothing because the foreign aid to Israel increased 347% from 1967 to 1968. And this is from this information comes from the Jewish Virtual Library. Aid to Israel went from 23.7 million in 1967 to 106.5 million in 1968, a 347% increase in aid to Israel after they committed an act of war against our country. So Jewish Virtual Library, it's a product of the American Israel Cooperative Enterprise. You can go on their website and read all the stuff. But the two things I want to point out, it has a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu, and this is what he says on their website. It says, there's a depth and richness of this relationship that is expressed every day. We have an enduring bond of values, interest, beginning with security, and the way that we share both information and other things to help the common defense of our common interests. And the whole purpose of this AIC, American Israel Cooperative Enterprise, is to encourage and support Israel. Well, this is Donald Trump, and this is what he's quoted on their website. The United States again reaffirms our unbreakable bond with our cherished ally, Israel. The partnership between our two countries, built on our shared values, has advanced the cause of human freedom, dignity, and peace. These are the building blocks of democracy. So, as I said back in the beginning, which was like point number 2, if President Trump really cared about our veterans, he would call for a full investigation into the USS Liberty attack, and he would give them the honor and recognition that they're due. The whole thing is these survivors were forced to keep this quiet until they died. And I think it was like 1982 or something when they finally decided, hey, we're going to come out and we're going to start talking about this. And it's the impact that it's made on the veterans, the families. I mean, there's just terrible human cost to this cover-up, and that they couldn't. And what the U.S. government did, they took the busted up Liberty, towed it into Malta, had it all fixed up, spiffed up, and they brought it back to the United States, and it looked like brand new. Nothing ever happened. They decommissioned the ship, and then scrapped it out, and basically told all the sailors involved, "Don't ever speak about this ever again, or I'll see you in Leavenworth," is one of the quotes. Anyway, I'd like to end my remarks by talking about the Prince of Peace, because we're talking about liberty here, but true liberty can only be found through Jesus Christ. And Jesus proclaimed his mission to the world when he quoted Isaiah saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And all the eyes of those in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." That's from Luke 4:18-21. So we will only see true, lasting peace and liberty in this world when we all bow our knee to the Lord Jesus Christ. Anyway, that's the opening, guys. Let's talk about it and how it's affected our society, and go from there.
Well, thank you, Craig. Go ahead, Chuck.
Craig, first question. Tell us what you feel, how you feel this has been carried forward into our present situation. If this happened, this incident happened during our Vietnamese war, as I
right. See, that's what these are kind of bookends on Vietnam. You've got the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that started at the beginning of the Vietnam War, and this is more towards the end. Both under Johnson, both false flag operations. So, what this Liberty incident, and it bothers me, because if you go on, it says the USS Liberty incident. This is not an incident. This is an all-out act of war against the United States. And so to cover it up and to try to water it down by calling it an incident, to me is just wrong. But anyway, to answer your question, what this has done, Chuck, is that as this aid to Israel has increased, there is nothing that we won't do to support Israel's quest for more land and fighting against the neighbors. This goes on with Iraq, Iran. It's what the Golan Heights. What we're doing with Syria, we're stealing Syria oil right now. I mean, this is going on and on. So the USS Liberty was just kind of the opening salvo in this latest iteration of land grab for Israel and supporting these endless wars. So that's where we're saying that this attack on liberty was a prelude to more endless wars, and that these serial wars are what's going on. That's what we see today. So the fact that you think about what if this had, if the truth had come out at the beginning. Just think how things have been changed. That one, we wouldn't have been supporting Israel when it was found out that they attacked us. We wouldn't be sending them all the millions of dollars. We wouldn't be supporting them in the wars. I saw one report where the amount of aid that, because we borrow the money to give to Israel, which, to get your mind around that one, all that money, all the interest would pay off the national debt. We are in debt, maxed out, because of the support of it. We would have been out of debt had we not been supporting these wars, Chuck.
Am I hearing, if I can paraphrase this a bit, or ask you what you think, would it be more fair to suggest that the state of Israel was actually acting as a hitman for certain warring factions in the United States, that they must have known this was happening before it ever happened, for them to make these conclusions that they made about deciding to cover up for Israel, rather than say, we are going to call for a conference and the result of it may be war against Israel. They didn't say that. Instead, they covered this. Would this give the thought that perhaps we should be thinking of Israel as a perpetual hitman that actually is carrying out the actions of somebody else, doing something politically that couldn't possibly be done by any group, party, individual, or financial faction in America, but which gets done almost every day. Now, we see incidents almost every day. And then after you address that, I'd like to talk about who are the people in the United States that are covering for this, because there has to be a cover-up.
Right. Again, it always gets, Chuck, back to, who's the man behind the curtain? Who's pulling the strings here? I mean, as Christians, we look at the evil, we look at the suffering, and all that leads back to Satan. He's the basically the prince of darkness. He's the deceiver. He's been a murderer and a thief since the beginning. So anything like this, you keep pulling the string. Eventually, it goes back to the satanic forces. Now the question is, who does he use through there? I mean, obviously, we've got you need money to fight a war, so you've got the banking interest, you've got the corporate interest, you've got all kinds of people who are pawns that Satan can play with, but they're just pawns, because, like I said, the only way we're going to get past this is bending our knee to the Prince of Peace. So you had another question in there, and I missed it.
Well, yes. It's one thing for us to bend our knee to the Prince of Peace, but how are we going to get the people that control the money, control the finances, control all those billions for war, and even control this financial aid that you described that went to Israel, ended up being many times the cost of the liberty to them? How do we
exactly
do that?
Well, again, you need to bring truth to the light. And I don't know if you saw in the last week or so, there's a faction over in Israel that do not like Netanyahu and his party, and through their Freedom of Information Act, they exposed that the Likud party has been giving millions of dollars to Christian evangelical Zionist organizations to affect the outcome of elections. So we've talked about the Russian issue, the Russian hoax, and all that. What you can prove is that Israel has been meddling in our elections and our electoral process since before they were founded as a nation. 48. I've got a book. This one right here is Genesis by Truman, the American Jews and the Origin of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's clear in that one that Truman was bought off by the Jewish lobby to go for Israel becoming a nation. So all kinds of people were involved in this. So yes, we're being used, and I think they're being played too, because it's not a, who would want to live in a place of such turmoil and chaos?
How are American Christian leaders involved in the cover-up of the continuing cooperation between the U.S. government and the State of Israel that continues to foster war, such as the war in Iraq? How are
obviously
Christians involved in this?
Well, obviously, Chuck, it goes back to bad theology. You know, we've talked about that. That's why we exist, to expose the errors of Christian Zionism to the evangelicals, to say, you know, this stuff is not Bible. This is a man-made doctrine. It's a political agenda. You're being sucked into this thing. We've already, like I said, the money's coming from Israel into, like, John Hagee, Christians United for Israel. What's her name? I'm drawing a blank on the lady that just it's her last name is Moore, but there's a that she got. What's that?
It's Ortega or something. It's a double hyphenation.
Yes. Anyway, yeah. It's so there's more to come as this gets exposed. I mean, it goes back to Jerry Falwell. I mean, remember the moral majority. Well, Jerry Falwell was meeting with Menachem Begin, who was the head of Irgun, who was part of the Deir Yassin massacre, slaughtering innocent Palestinian men, women, and children. And so he becomes prime minister. Jerry Falwell is becoming a buddy with him. Falwell gets a jet, you know, to fly around in. I mean, this is so deep, Chuck. It's into, and it all comes out of bad theology. Because if Christians would understand that this is not Jesus, this is not Bible, then why are we doing this? Because it doesn't make sense to support another nation that's going around stealing property and killing people, and it doesn't make sense. So why would you do that as a Christian? You wouldn't. And so I was thinking, as this gets exposed about all the money coming into the evangelicals, it's not going to affect the evangelical support for Israel. They're going to keep on going, because there is such a cognitive dissonance between truth, scripture, fact, what's going on the ground. They won't get it. There has to be some epiphany, and we've all talked about that. For you, Chuck, it was being in Gaza and seeing fire rain out of the sky out of our military helicopters that Israel was using to punish the Gazans. You know, for me, it was meeting Christian Palestinians who I didn't know exist. You know, and Tom, you know, you've been over there in Bethlehem. We've seen enough to realize, you know, it's time out. This what the Christians are doing is wrong.
In kind of in response to that, recently Larry King interviewed a number of Christians on live. Larry King, of course, is thought of as a liberal Jew or conservative Jew, but whatever he is, he's not thought of as a Christian leader.
Right.
And yet he asked these people very pointed questions about war. And Bob Jones, the founder of Bob Jones University,
yeah,
and one of the most prominent Christians, he was asked about war and their position on war, and here's his answer: "It's not a matter of Christians supporting wars. Christians support peace, and in order to have a just peace, sometimes you have to have war." Now, is that doublespeak or is that doublespeak? Either Christians are opposed to war or they're not. And it is well noted that we've never had a war on our own territory since what? The Civil War in 1860.
Yeah, or last week.
That's the last one on our territory. So this interview with Larry King, he seemed to be getting it as he went through interviewing these people. As he went along interviewing Bob Jones and John MacArthur and other famous Christian leaders, he began to seem to realize, hey, these guys are not really on the side of peace.
Chuck, could I make a correction here? This Larry King Live. It was an interview on March 11th, 2003, 9 days before the Second Gulf War, when this one. This is so it's quite relevant to the fact that the evangelical Christians were supporting this war even before it started.
Right.
We hold these truths in October of 2002, November of 2002, conducted our first vigil in front of a Southern Baptist church in Scottsdale, Arizona, because a man named Richard Land, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, had written a letter to George Bush, signed by prominent evangelical leaders, that said going to war with Iraq, against Iraq and Saddam Hussein would be a just war. And Chuck Carlson saw through that. We challenged these churches. Who would Jesus bomb? No more wars for Israel. Blessed are the peacemakers. And so that's the bottom line. The evangelical Christians, because of religious beliefs, have literally forsaken and turned their back on what Jesus taught. And this is the crisis of the day, as I see it.
Yeah.
And you're right about John MacArthur. He actually offered, and in this same interview, he gave a pretty good excuse for following the president because he trusted him. Whereas the mainline pastor and the priest said, hey, we need to look into this, investigate, talk about it. And so basically the evangelicals said, yeah, we got to support the president, and if we kill people, that's what the government has to do. So,
all right, this goes right back to the notion then that there's a reason why Christian leaders are supportive of our continuous wars, especially if Israel is involved. If Israel is somehow affected, they are able to round up the support of people like John MacArthur and the others, and get carte blanche support for them. And of course, Bob Jones simply made an excuse why we need war, even if we are against war. And so this is what Christian Zionists have to do in order to justify their acts. So what, gentlemen, would be the one place that you would recommend listeners to go to where they could get a concise story on this? What do you recommend, Craig and Tom? What's your best?
Well, I think you need to go to WeHoldTheseTruths.org.
Give them something from our website.
Exactly. Yeah, because that's what I did when I did my search on Christian Zionism years ago, Chuck. You guys popped up, and here we are. I don't know. It's been 5-6 years later.
Oh, it's been 7 years.
Has it been 7 years? Yeah, time flies when you're having fun.
Craig, yeah.
I'm getting older.
Yeah. But anyway, I know we're getting kind of long on time here, so I would just like to close out by saying there are so many good books on the liberty issue, and another one that gets right to what we're talking about is right here. This one by Mearsheimer and Walt. That gets right into it. The Israeli lobby, and it becomes like a cult. It really is with support for Israel in our country. So I'd encourage any of the viewers, the listeners. What was that?
Tom, do you have something to?
Well, we would recommend that people go to our site, WHTT.org, and watch our award-winning documentary, Christian Zionism, The Tragedy and Turning. And this will give you a good, it's only 29 minutes, but it'll give you a good understanding of the theology behind what we call Christian Zionists, with this belief that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. We have lots of resources. There's a documentary there about the war-based Christian Zionist evangelical leaders that we've been talking about. So we have a lot of resources there. Our book, One Nation Under Israel, interestingly, was originally published as Holocaust 2, Saving Israel from Suicide. And by any honest observation, there looks like Israel is committing suicide. This book may be quite prophetic with the fighting going on, as Craig mentioned, opposition to Netanyahu. And so it is causing division. And the key really is education. And that's what we're about, is trying to educate people to the truth of what's going on. It's a very difficult thing, but do your own research. That's what we ask folks. Don't believe us, do your own research. And we have a lot of resources. We hold these truths in existence since 1996, and we've conducted close to 200 vigils at Christian Zionist churches, including Christians United for Israel, even at their national event. So we have been challenging, and we would call on other people to challenge fellow Christians by talking with them. Ask our question: do you believe the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy? And if they are hesitant, maybe they'll listen to you. So it is all about educating people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Correct.
Great.
Why don't we just end with a word of prayer here? Lord, thank you for this time. We thank you for the preparation that Craig did about this event that is so little known about the history. We see man's sin nature manifested in these perpetual wars, and your son Jesus offered the alternative as a Prince of Peace. And we thank you that we can still are able to speak out on these issues, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. And good evening.
Good night.